I think what I learned from that is that in order to effect change, in order to improve something, you have to step backwards in your level and be really bad at it for a while in order to replace a bad habit with a good habit.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology. So I thought I'd try to set the stage for our conversation today by providing a little bit of context around one of the main things that I was hoping to ask you about. So the long story is about 30 years ago now, I was in this piano trio with some friends, and we had the opportunity to study with you and some other coaches for a few weeks at a chamber music workshop in Israel. And one of the other coaches that was there that year was Leon Fleisher. And in one of our coachings, he asked us to start subdividing more. And this wasn't because we were dragging or rushing per se, or because he wanted us to play metronomically, of course. This is more about his way of trying to get us to play more expressively and to take more time, but in such a way that everything still remained in proportion and we weren't like distorting things or just taking time randomly because we felt like it. I think that was the summer after my freshman year of college. And so it took quite a while for that idea to make sense to me. And I don't know that it really sunk in until maybe my first or second year of grad school. But when it did finally click, it was pretty transformative. It changed my experience mentally as well in terms of my experience performing. It gave me something very tangible and meaningful to focus on when I was playing. And I was much more present and engaged in each moment. And it felt more like I was creating in each moment instead of worrying about mistakes or trying not to screw things up. And so I remember there was a workshop maybe a few years ago during the pandemic. We happened to chat about this ever so briefly in passing, but not really in any kind of depth at all. And so I've been wanting to pick your brain about this ever since. And so I'm excited that we'll have a chance to do that today. But before we get to that, I wonder if I could maybe ask you to share your viola origin story, as it were, like how you started, how you came to do this professionally, whether it was something that just happened organically or if there was like this moment where you just realized you had to do this. I'm just kind of curious to see if we could maybe start there.
Well, I started in the public school system in Phoenix, Arizona around 1963 or 64. We had a district-wide string orchestra that would, at some time during the year, they would go and give little presentations in order to stir up some new players. And they came to my grade school, and we had an assembly. And like many things, you don't understand why, but something clicked when I heard that music played, and I asked to sign up to be in the orchestra. That was just a kind of fateful decision. And I also chose the viola right away. Had I known, I probably would have started with the violin, and the violin is a little bit easier to actually physically play because the viola is a little bit mismatched in terms of size and what have you. But all things being equal, the viola spoke to me because I liked the sound, and also nobody else liked it. And I was always one of those people that enjoyed being a little bit on the outside and rooting for the underdog. So I picked the viola, or it picked me, and I studied privately in Phoenix with a wonderful teacher who was a member of the Pittsburgh Symphony, who was actually blacklisted in 1952 for having attended a communist cell meeting in Elizabeth or Newark, New Jersey, where he grew up. But anyway, he ended up in Phoenix teaching music, and then ended up playing the Phoenix Symphony. And so I studied with him for about 6 years, possibly, and then went to the University of Southern California for 3 years with Milton Thomas as my teacher. And then, having heard Michael Tree in a performance with the Guarneri Quartet for the second time, because they played in Phoenix, but I was very young. And the second time, it was a little bit like Harry Potter, the Z on my forehead, and I felt like I had to go work with him. So I transferred to Curtis in 75, spent 4 years there, was always interested in chamber music, and attended the Marlborough Festival for 10 summers, and eventually played in a string quartet after freelancing in New York for some years, playing in Felix Gallagher's string quartet for 8 years, and then moved on to the Orion string quartet, where we are now final season before retiring in April with a concert at Alice Tully Hall.
Now that I have kids, I'm just kind of curious about the context around which young folks start playing and continue to play. Were your parents musicians at all, or did they have any music experience themselves growing up, or did they just love music, or what was that like for you?
My mother played a little bit of piano. She grew up actually in a unique situation in that her father was a professional gambler and ran hotels in Las Vegas during the famous era of the 40s and 50s. And so she learned piano as a young girl and played a couple pieces on piano. My sister played enough piano to learn I could have danced all night in bossa nova rhythm, which I think means you don't use both hands at the same time. And so very little background in music, although my dad loved music and would go with me to the Phoenix Symphony concerts every week. And we would have our special time together. So no background there, but it was that one assembly in school. And when I started playing the instrument, it seemed easy to play. Obviously, I loved the music and I would practice as little as possible, but enough to get by. And I figured at a very early age that this must be my future because of how comfortable I was with it. I would say probably a couple of years ago that it was the easiest thing to do, so why not? But now I think there was more an emotional attraction to it.
At this point, our conversation went off on a bit of a tangent, and we reminisced for a few moments about the chamber music workshop where I first met and got to study with Steven. But eventually we got back on track, and we'll pick things up right there as I describe what pianist Leon Fleisher, who is one of the other coaches at that workshop, asked me and my trio mates to do. I think it might have been the slow movement of the Schubert B-flat piano trio that we were working on, where he asked us to subdivide, and we very diligently subdivided, and then he stopped us again to say that now it sounded like we were playing with a metronome, and that wasn't at all the point of subdividing. Like, the idea was to be able to play around with time and play more freely and take more time even, but in a way that didn't mean distorting things randomly. And I think we've heard this message from all of our teachers at some point or another where they say you can take as much time as you want as long as you give it back, or something to that effect. But there was something about the way in which he explained it and the way that he had us do it that, again, it took a few years for it to really kind of make sense to me. But when it did, it really was pretty transformative musically and even technically. And I think there's lots of other ramifications about it too, whether it's bow distribution or dynamics and so forth. So I mean, I wish I could explain it as eloquently as he did. And that's one of the sessions where I don't have a tape of him. But you had mentioned this concept being a meaningful one to you as well. And so I wondered if I could ask you to elaborate on it a bit and kind of explain what this is all about, what it means, and so forth.
I remember something with Leon Fleischer in a similar, but not exactly that piece, but some group maybe at Carnegie Hall was playing the C minor Brahms piano quartet, Opus 60. And of course, there's that beautiful slow movement starts with a cello solo. And he had the cellist do the same thing where he said, take the smallest value in that music that you're playing, which in that case was a 16th note, and then play or sing the phrase playing with all 16th notes. And I guess the point he was getting at is that the change of sound on long notes would be best illustrated if you actually heard the subdivisions in it. And I think when you become more sensitive to that, you don't have to play separate notes. But I quite often have students do that. I even sometimes play tremolo in demonstrating something in terms of phrasing and sound. And I know we're probably talking about a rhythmic thing as well. But in terms of phrasing, longer notes are actually made up of many small pieces. And I think it was Georgie Shabach from Indiana that said, if you want to play louder, you must hear more. And he also said long notes are long because they have to be. I mean, a long note needs more time in order to affect change. And we change the sound because we're changing the emotional content of the music. I mean, I could get very detailed on it, but music is basically living in an emotional state, but it's not living in an emotional state, it's living in changing emotional states. So things are constantly in flux. And I think when we grow up, we were told to count and hold a long note a certain amount of time, but we're not really taught that if we change the sound or the feeling of that note, then we actually can count better. And that probably gets to the counting part. Because if you line up and you coordinate with the change of sound on a note, whether it being softening, intensifying, changing color, all those things, then you're in tune with the subdivisions, and then your rhythm becomes quite naturally attached to the musical effect that you're trying to make. So I remember hearing those things. And, of course, we always have these statements that people make that maybe don't mean as much at the time, but mean more later, as you just mentioned. And those have gotten me thinking. And of course, I don't want to feel like the technicality of describing how to phrase or how to show an emotion should actually be the end all. It's just a way of helping and assisting some students who are talented, gifted, but maybe they're not quite in touch with the purpose of the music, which I think is to effect these changes of emotional states. A slow piece can be described as fast music stretched out, and a fast piece can be described as very slow music compressed. But in all cases, I think the change in emotional states is something that is generally slow moving, even if the music is quick. Does that make sense? I'm not quite sure if that explains it clearly, but even when Mr. Fleischer was singing that beautiful solo to the Brahms piano quartet, he was showing how the expression was changing from note to note.
This reminds me a little bit of what one of my teachers, Paul Cantor, said one summer. And at the time, I don't know that it, again, one of those things that didn't make sense to me at the time, but I realized later what he was talking about. Something about how, the sheet music in front of me was a very poor or mediocre way of capturing what the music actually was. And that there's only so much detail that you can put onto a page that doesn't really begin to capture the nuances and details of what symbolically the black markings were to represent. And it sounds a little bit like, in that sense, I think what you're saying is that each note, like when we're little and we're starting off, each note is really just a measure of time that we're supposed to hold something before we let it go. And we don't really think too much about how that sound should change during the duration of that particular length of time that it's marked as supposedly supposed to take on the page, and the beginnings of the notes, the ends of the notes, the within the note itself, and how that can change in many different ways depending on how long it is. I wonder if that's maybe what I was hearing you say in terms of the changing emotional states.
Yes, and every note creates the following note. I demonstrate that quite a bit with the Brahms F minor clarinet / viola sonata opening of the viola line that comes in after the piano introduction, in that it's another philosophy or maybe description of what happens in music. I believe that for the most part that rising notes are in an act of intensifying and descending notes are in the process of releasing something, as a generalized, overly generalized way of thinking of things. Of course, that goes back to Pablo Casals and Alexander Schneider yelling at us in various orchestras that I played in. And at the time, I just thought these guys they'd oversimplified music to a point. And then you start, as you say, you start thinking about it and coming back again and again. So back to the Brahms example, the first note descends on major third from a C natural to an A flat, and then the next note is an F. So I demonstrate in that case to students that if you have a certain intensity at the beginning of that phrase, then you release your sound to lower it to the feeling of that A flat, and then continue to the F natural, which then in 2 beats has to rise a minor tenth to an A flat. And as soon as you play the F natural, you're changing the sound to a great intensity in order to vocalize, as it were, the leap up the minor tenth. So if we change the sound to, I would say, highlight the changes in feeling that's going on there, which is this allegro appassionato sensation of turmoil and unease, and attempt to try and achieve something, then those changes really help the music to come across to the listener to the point where they sense the emotional feeling, hopefully that was in the mind of the composer as he was writing the notes, which is, I think, really important for people at some point to try and figure out what he was getting at. Then we have a teamwork going on between us. So those were very interesting to me. And you talk about the Schubert B-flat trio slow movement, which I believe it's a cello solo at the opening, and repeated in the violin, these appoggiatura notes which have stress on it that have to release to a lower note, the second measure being a step higher. And so expressing that in that way both takes care of the feeling and the tension and release in the music, as well as the timing of it, depending on how you feel that release happening. It's ultimately completely natural. Some people come to it and don't even think about it and have that ability to do that. Others, with, I think, some help, can kind of catch that power in the music without sounding artificial.
Is there any chance you might be able to demonstrate a little bit what it is, some of what we're talking about, just so that it's sometimes, picture's worth 1,000 words, as it were, like how you would have a student play the smallest note values or the tremolo that you described, or even the opening of that Brahms moment that you were describing as an example?
Yeah, I haven't practiced very much, but I would be willing to give it a shot on that.
Sure.
My instrument, all the strings loosened last night because it's about 25 degrees and no humidity. So, this all started at my first lesson at Curtis with Michael Tree, who said to me when we were working on a Bach cello suite, he started to describe what a phrase was. And he said that basically it's like an arch or a rainbow. It has a beginning, it reaches a high point, and then has an ending, which is settled back down. And that's, again, one of those moments that, of course, everybody knows that, but maybe my teachers back then assumed that was a given and hadn't described it. And Michael Tree and I worked for 4 years together dissecting phrases all the time. And that was one of the great things about him, and his music, which was so natural sounding, he would spend hours and hours and hours on every note that he played. And that's an amazing quality. So when I said I was describing the sound of something to the effect of something like that, the descent of that opening measure, in order to get from the C natural to the A flat, I have to change the first note so that the second note is almost predictable by the time I play it. You can almost tell what I'm doing before it happens. And then in order to get to the level of that 10th that's coming up, you have to make quite a big change in and so forth and so on. So you can hear it as I hear it, or as I said before, in even something along that line.
So the tremolo, that was awesome to see what you meant by that. How would the pulses or the subdivisions fit in? Like if we were psychic and we could read your mind as you were playing that, what's going through your mind as you're organically measuring out how that process is going to happen from one note to the next?
It's a little bit like sampling that happens now in digital recordings, in that what you're not hearing is a analog, continuously produced recording of something, but you're hearing little parts of it. And the more pieces we can put in, like if you just took and took it down one level and you played quarter notes, the sound of the second quarter note is going to be where your sound would be changing. If you took it one more level and played eighth notes, it would be something like that. And I'm sure that Leon Fleisher that's what he was thinking, because usually when I have students play subdivisions, it would sound like it would sound something to that, like that, which is not the point. That's where it sounds just metronomic and mechanical. And so we're trying to just play musically on every note, I guess is the easiest, simplest way to say it. So there's that. I guess you could subdivide it one more level of something like something like that. That's actually a little bit describing something that shouldn't be described ultimately. But I think as a technique, it does help to associate changing of sound intensities with something that you can latch onto if you're not sensitive to it naturally.
Sometimes it's hard for us to remember things that we didn't know once upon a time once we come to know it. But in my head right now, I'm thinking all of this maybe is predicated on having a pretty clear concept of what it is that you want the phrase to sound like in the first place, perhaps. Because this brings me back to something else that I remember Fleischer and the others were trying to get us to do. And that's just, I mean, we spent so long just on the first few lines of the Schubert B flat first movement. We barely got to anything else in the time that we're there. And one of the key things they're trying to get us to do is to be more descriptive in words about the character of that opening. And for whatever reason, we really struggled with that. Like, you know, we said upbeat or cheerful. And eventually they came up with this grand image of Cyrano de Bergerac and this feather and the cap on a horse, like the whole 9 yards. And that really changed how we played. If you listen to our first performance and the last performance, it drastically different character and mood that we tried to create. But one of the things that Fleischer, I remember saying when we failed to be as descriptive and clear as he wanted us to be about what we saw as the character of that section, something along the lines of how if you can't describe what you're going for in words, it's probably because the concept itself isn't clear enough. Like you can't hear it or you can't imagine it clearly enough in your head to be able to describe it. So I wondered if similarly with this sort of thing, is it possible to experiment without having a clear concept of what you want the phrase to sound like? Or is this maybe the work that you and Mr. Tree did with constructing phrases or understanding phrases or break them apart in some way, perhaps?
Well, I think a lot of students, and I would count myself among them, didn't have a clear idea of why music was so effective or the purpose of it. I used to maybe think of it in more athletic terms, in that your value was how accurately you played, or that you would learn the notes of a piece of music and then you would come back and your teacher would help you with some ideas in terms of interpretation. Then you get into, well, some people are more natural in their interpretation of very exciting, virtuosic music, and some people are more natural in terms of expressing more internal, tender kind of expressions. And then that gets into the idea that, well, that fits their social personalities and what have you. But it was all Greek to me when I had that lesson with Mr. Tree, and he would say, like, how does this phrase work? And I'm going, what's a phrase? And maybe that's a failing of early teaching, possibly as well, because I think my early teacher assumed that I understood more than I did. And I know from my teaching at Curtis Institute and other places in chamber music, you ask, like you said in the Schubert, describe the character. And very few people would come up with actual emotional terms like majestic, heroic, euphoric, all those terms. And that reminds me, there's another teacher at Curtis when I was studying there, Karen Tuttle, who was very adamant in talking about the different characters of music. And she even had a student who made up a little chart of human emotional terms, which I give to my students to this day and kind of tweaked it a little bit here and there. And that's also very helpful. And during a coaching of string quartet, I'll take my iPad out and put my little chart up there and say, okay, pick something. And it's really helpful for a young artist to start associating those things.
What you just said about teachers sometimes perhaps assuming too much. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and I'd have to look up the details to be able to pinpoint which study this was exactly, but they were describing a study where they looked at how well students did in subsequent classes in a particular area after they took the intro class with either tenured, renowned teachers for their intro class versus not so renowned teachers for their intro class. And they were curious, how would those students do when they continued on to higher level courses? And what they actually found is that the students who were in the classes of the most well-known faculty, they actually did worse in subsequent classes than the students who had less well-known faculty for intro. It's so difficult sometimes to remember what it was like to not know anything that it's easy, I think, for a lot of assumptions to be made and for very basic things to get left out, perhaps, or explained in a way that doesn't make sense to someone who has no concept of it. So I think that can be a real challenge that's hard to get around.
Right. I think we should all take up hobbies that we're really poor at or something new. I mean, one of my other passions is to play golf, and I'm not very good at it, but boy, I love working at it because it's a fresh way of going back to my youth, where had I had the maturity and the patience, I would have maybe done things in a different way. It just helps you to kind of reconnect with what it feels like, as you say, to not be at a level that you want to be and be able to communicate that in a more effective way to a student.
Is there any chance you can think of a specific example of something that you learned in struggling to improve your golf game that then led you to approach a student, or something in your own practicing or performing differently because of that insight you gained from being a beginner again in a different domain?
Well, the golf swing itself is very similar to playing an instrument. It's a balletic motion. And I think what I learned from that is that in order to effect change, in order to improve something, you have to step backwards in your level and be really bad at it for a while in order to replace a bad habit with a good habit. And I think there's a certain reluctance to actually do something that's going to have not a better result immediately. It's a very complicated motion, a golf swing. It's extremely complex, as I would say, as is a bow stroke. It seems very simple, you learn to move your shoulder first, and then you open your forearm, and you continue out to, at least to start a straight line, and the bow has to be parallel to the bridge, and it has to not move around. For us, who's been, people have been doing it for 50 years, it's not so difficult, but people learning, it's quite challenging. Ida and I were just in Hong Kong, and we were coaching chamber music groups at the Academy of Performing Arts in Hong Kong, and there was one young man who had that locked elbow thing, and we did everything in our power to try and get him to take a chance to feel like, I was having him toss rags or balls or something, like, or frisbees, to feel like what it feels like to open your arm up and stuff like that. And after about 9 days, the students performed, and he performed, and his bow arm was like beautiful. It was open, and we cried. It was such a great experience for all of us, including him, because he was so happy because he felt the results. But boy, I bet it was going through a lot of pain but persistence on his part, because he believed in what people were trying to help him do.
Yeah, it can be a real challenge to, like you said, risk making things worse for a moment in order to then get to a place where things are ultimately better. This is maybe kind of a line of questioning that's out of left field a tiny bit, but I love that some of your bios online mention that you're involved or have been involved for many years in dog breeding and showing and so forth. And I wonder are there things that you've learned from being involved with dogs and animals that have found their way into your own practice, performing and teaching as well?
Well, I would say that being completely in the dark about dogs, we got our first, quote, show dog in 1985, and Gus was his name, and he was a very, very beautiful and successful dog in dog show world stature, but he was also a wonderful pet too. He had a lot of personality, and we had a great time with him. But what happened is that after 2 or 3 years, and he had finished his championship, and we were then what they call campaigning him, which was sending him out week after week and trying to put him in like a top 10 of all the Violas in terms of how many dog show he had won. And that our handlers, who were professional, said, I think we've done everything we can do with Gus. You can show him yourself, you can have fun, whatever. So that was me that started that, because Ida was too shy in order to get into the ring. She didn't really know, and I didn't know anything, and I was terrible at it. And I remember going to dog shows with her, and she would snap a roll of film, and we would run over to the 1 hour photo place and get it processed and look at it, and I would try and improve and all that. And I got to a point where I was okay at it, but Ida got into the ring a couple years after I did with a dog, and she loved it. You couldn't pull her out of the dog show rings, even to this day. She's really smitten with it, and she's excellent at it. And I guess the point I'm making at it, and the difference between her and myself, is that Ida has an uncanny way of looking in the mirror, seeing what is there and what's lacking and what needs to be improved, and doing it, which is a quality I think in all great artists. I'm probably a little bit more of an emotional person, and so my holding my emotions at bay is very difficult. It's also difficult for her, but she also is able to see the reality of things. And I think if anybody were to want to become really great at something, they have to take a personal accounting and find out what it is that actually they need to improve, and do everything in their power they can, which in some cases, like the golf swing and the bow arm, may be quite uncomfortable. To me, that's what the dog show world has kind of shown us. Our dogs are children, our pets, they're companions, They have great personalities, and we've been doing this now for coming up on 39 years of being involved. And so you learn something from everything you do, hopefully.
I love that you guys were doing film study for your performance in the ring, handling the dogs or showing the dogs. That's awesome. I have to assume that film study or recording has been part of your golf learning as well as your viola learning.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when I take lessons, and that's what I sort of feel like even at our advanced stage of being professional musicians, we should be having coaches like athletes do, that outside set of eyes. And I play for Ida quite often, that getting sort of a disinterested set of eyes and ears is very helpful. And I think that I encourage my students to have practice buddies so that they have somebody who can kind of not only check on them and help them, but more so to make sure that they're honest with what they're trying to achieve and don't put the rose-colored glasses on.